Here I will rehearse a radical view of the origins of the Hebrew Scriptures, seeing them as an essentially Platonic project of the 3rd century BC. The hypothesis has mainly been developed by Russell Grimmerken and presented in his book Berossus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus, Hellenistic Histories and the Date of the Pentateuch, 2006. Also his Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible. But it has been advanced in other studies and by other scholars in various forms in the past as well. The immediate problem is that the Hebrew Scriptures, the Torah, is unknown prior to the Septuagint, circa mid-3rd century BC. The Septuagint is presented as a translation of Hebrew originals, but these are now deemed lost. But there is no tangible evidence of them having ever existed. In our smattering of pre-Septuagint Hebrew text we find no biblical names or biblical quotations, and indeed the Hebrews seem polytheistic, much like their neighbours. The appearance of the Hebrew Scriptures, a Hebrew national literature with laws and constitution and a vigorous monotheism, is concurrent with the Greek Septuagint. The proposal is that the Septuagint is not in fact a translation, but that the Greek and Hebrew Scriptures were written together concurrently as part of the same undertaking, the project directly orchestrated by Ptolemy Sator in Alexandria. The project was to provide the Jews, 1/4 of Alexandria, and a wealthy literate elite with a national literature. This idea in itself is Platonic. It is in Plato, in his Laws dialogue especially, that we find the idea of a national literature. Plato is concerned with how Greek colonies and new polities should be formed. The Ptolemaic project was to create a Hebrew national literature and follows the Platonic program. There is a cosmology, foundation myths, history, laws delivered by a lawgiver. The project seeks to integrate the Jews into Hellenic culture by giving them the expected accoutrements of a distinct people. It is a nation-building exercise in the Hellenistic mode. Our record of the Ptolemaic project, the letter of Aristeas, is late and spurious, but nonetheless revealing. It is explained that Ptolemy wanted the Jewish laws and literature included in the Library of Alexandria, that is, to integrate the Jews into his cosmopolitan vision. The story is that up to this point, the Jews had kept their scriptures secret. They had never been seen before. But the priests agreed that their books should be included in the library. They wanted to be part of the Ptolemaic synthesis. Famously, they sent 72 scholars who, quite miraculously, produced the Septuagint from supposed Hebrew originals so that the Jews might be included among the peoples of the Hellenistic world. What has happened is that the Hebrew Scriptures and the Septuagint were composed at this point together, one version in Hebrew, one in Greek. It is not credible that it was a secret literature up to that point. The contents of this new national literature is pure myth-making, but again after the Platonic pattern and with distinctly Hellenistic features. The formal organisation of tribes, a neat 12 tribes, is after the Platonic pattern. The Israelites are organised like a Greek colony. Russell Grimmerken has made an extensive study of the laws, the Torah, legal codes, to show their strong dependence upon the laws of Plato and their Greek rather than ethnic Near Eastern foundations. Plato's laws emerges as the blueprint. Monotheism arose first from the Platonic one, but also as part of the fictitious claim that the Jews were an ancient people of Egypt. The Akhenaten revolution in Pharaonic history proposed that monotheism was original and that polytheism was a falling away from it. This was widely assumed thereafter, extending eventually into the Islamic worldview. Monotheism therefore implies great antiquity. The crafting of the Hebrew foundation narrative and laws, based largely on Plato's program for the founding of colonies as set out in his dialogue, Laws, elevated the Semitic deity to a monotheism with an ancient history. Again, prior to that time, the Jews were as polytheistic as their neighbours. Monotheism established a unique legitimacy and antiquity in Hellenic estimations. The biblical creation narrative and cosmology depends upon Plato's Timaeus. The texts up to the book of Joshua are part of this Ptolemaic project, which was imposed upon, accepted by, and welcomed by the Jews. In the story, the translations made by the 72 were sent to Jerusalem, where they were embraced as the national literature without question. Subsequent extensions of the narrative were made in Jerusalem, but with this twist: the Septuagint and Torah were made with the considerable input from Samaritans, and is sympathetic to Mount Gerizim against Jerusalem centralism. Not so the extensions, where the Samaritans are marginalised. And so we find this split in Second Temple Judaism. The Samaritans remain more faithful to the deal done with Ptolemy. It should be said and underlined at this point that the very notion that a ruler such as Ptolemy Sator should conduct such a project, a major exercise in religious nation building, is itself a norm condoned in Platonic statecraft. It is expected that wise rulers engage in noble lies. There is nothing untoward, it is quite Platonic, to craft a mythology and a literature under state sponsorship for the purposes of social cohesion or strategic stability. Moreover, the model of a fictive history of historical verisimilitude is provided by Plato's story of Atlantis, one of the tallest tales ever told, but told with a high degree of detailed historical verisimilitude. This same posture, mythopoeic fictions given the appearance of a complex history, is typical of the biblical narratives after the Platonic example. Genesis would have been impossible, that is to say, if Plato had not written the Atlantis story first as a model of that type of storytelling. The most famous case of pre-Septuagint Hebrew texts are those found at Elephantine in Upper Egypt, texts from just prior to the Septuagint. There's no sign of the Torah or of monotheism or biblical names or narratives, or the notion that the Jerusalem temple is exclusive. They display a very different type of Judaism indeed. How then was Judaism suddenly transformed into a monotheism with an ancient history, a legal system, a national epic? Needless to say, the outlook presented here is resisted with vigour or hysteria from all quarters, but it seems a natural or at least plausible reading of the facts. Once we view the biblical text through this lens, much becomes apparent. The Hebrew scriptures appear suddenly out of nowhere, and their appearance as part of the Septuagint project initiated and sponsored for coherent political reasons by Ptolemy. What emerges from the project bears the imprint of the Platonized Hellenistic minds of the Alexandrian intellectual elite, dressed up as an ancient ethnic literature. This is just to give an outline of the case. The central figure is Plato, the Hellenistic Plato, especially the Plato of the Laws and the late dialogues, Timaeus, Critias Laws, where we find the blueprint for just such a national literature with cosmology and legal code, and a universalized, very abstract deity, a tribal god reshaped somewhat by the notion of the Platonic One. In short, the Torah and the Septuagint are concurrent creations made by the Alexandrian intellectual elite in Ptolemaic Egypt as an essentially Platonic undertaking. Plato is pervasive in that intellectual milieu. This is the most natural explanation for the sudden appearance of a fully formed Hebrew national literature no earlier than the 3rd century BC. This renders Moses, the Exodus, all of that fictive. There is no shortage of scholars, historians, archaeologists who have always suspected so. The problem is to give an account of where these fictions came from, under what inspiration, and the purposes they served. The best account is the one sketched here.